This is the third in a series of lectures for Justice and Law. We want to begin with common law, which is an ancient law of England, basically based on societal customs, right, and recognized as such and enforced by judgments and decrees of the courts. Basically, the general body of statutes and case law that governed England and the American colonies prior to the American Revolution. Fundamentally, it's nothing more than principles and rules of action embedded in case law rather than legislative enactments. Now, let me explain the difference. When we talk about common law, we're talking about customs, things that have been accepted. Legislation or legislative enactments is some legislative body in the United States, it's Congress, that writes law and says, basically, this is what shall happen, or this is how this dispute will be resolved. It structures what the government and people can do, legislative enactments, statutes, that sort of thing. Protections of people, property, authority, all of it. So you can say the opposite of statutory law, an equitable law or civil law, is common law, but it's common law in action. So what's really important to keep in mind here is that the common law system, which dates all the way back to England, has been taken up by a lot of different sides, those basically controlled by England, conquered by England, that sort of thing. But under the common law system, any disputes that exist are settled through an adversarial exchange of arguments and, of course, evidence. Each side presents their case, and it could be a judge or jury hears that, and then the judge or jury evaluates the evidence and the arguments on both sides, applies its appropriate law, and renders a decision. So basically, that's the structure of it. Of course, you can appeal, but in a common law system, the court reviews only the findings of law, not the determinations of facts. In other words, you don't re-argue the case. You don't bring in the facts and say, look at these facts. Shouldn't they have found for the plaintiff in the lower court? It doesn't work that way. They review only the findings of law. They want to make sure that the process and the law is what's been done correctly. So under even the common law structure, everybody are subject to the same set of laws. Now, this is very important. Basically, we don't care who you are. You could be a member of the lowest class, or you could be a member of the upper class, or even a member of the governing body of people. The judiciary can review legislation, right, and determine whether or not it conforms to constitutional requirements or norms. So everyone is held to the same standard, or at least presumably that's how it works. Keep in mind that this is very different than divine natural law. It's important to keep this in mind. Divine natural law is consistent with other types of law, right? Basically because it's built on principles of truth, justice, compassion. Not that far afield at all from what other systems we've discussed are built upon. The difference is the source of those structures, which is divine, right? As opposed to people. And also, the argument here is that any law made by man must be consistent with the law set down by God. And if it's not, then the law is not valid and the people shouldn't obey that law. So that's what we have in terms of the structure. The Declaration of Independence and a whole host of other documents are very consistent. And so we're not really looking at anything that should be or come as a surprise to anyone in terms of previous lectures here. The key thing I want you to keep in mind is that there has always been, once societies have been formed, always been some kind of law. Whether it's been corrupted or not doesn't really matter at this point. The same way we form nations and societies, we establish a set of rules. Now, where those rules come from and how we arrive at them may differ. But fundamentally, you can keep a society together, regardless of what the process, the structure of the laws as they've been created are. You have to be able to keep a society together because there's some fundamental measure of justice. There's no other reason to remain in a society or not revolt against it if the things that you seek on a fundamental level are not being granted. So, again, if you look at the historical natural law, which that's how we think of it in terms of conforming with these well-established unwritten customs and traditions and experiences, historical natural law, because that's where its source of legitimacy lies. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about historical natural law, divine natural law itself. The whole purpose behind them and the purpose behind this course is examining the concepts of justice in terms of law. Law is the codification of a society's morals and ethics. Law is a coming together of the concepts that are fundamentally responsible, the building blocks for creating a rationale for joining that society and remaining a part of that society, because there is a promise of the likelihood, more than likely actually, but at least a likelihood, that you are going to prosper more. You are going to do better for yourself in terms of life and liberty and property by becoming a member of that society, because that society will keep those things in order for you, protect them, and make sure the playing field is level, that things are fair. When it ceases to do that, it's not really fulfilling its primary function of protecting those things and advancing the life, liberty, and the ability to acquire property of its people. Now, why are these things important? Because this is how we live our life, right? We want to be free. I can't think of a single instance in history where a person or any group said we want to be oppressed and we don't want to be free. We're free in nature. We've always been free in nature. The problem is that nature can be pretty difficult to bear up under, right? Not just the elements, but the structure of life itself, other animals, and the like. So it's never been supported by masses of people that the concept that we should be left in nature. That is to say, no forming of groups, maybe some tribes, but that's about it. Keep in mind something else. One of the fundamental purposes here that we haven't spoken about is this idea of peace. Liberty, life, acquisition of property, these things don't happen unless there's peace. Forming a nation increases the likelihood of peace, or at least it should. As people act in concert with one another, it's easier to resolve major disputes with other peoples than it is on an individual basis or a tribal basis. So we want life, which I think is pretty clear why we want it. Liberty, it means freedom. It means freedom from the elements. It means freedom from the vagaries of life. It means freedom from the corruption or the oppression of others. Who wouldn't want that? And property, I think for a lot of people, is where getting their minds around is very difficult. I think people think that the acquisition of property is problematic, that somehow it's an indicator of a society that's hell-bent on satisfying its every whim and want at the expense of everybody else. The acquisition of property simply means that what you've worked for, what you've toiled for, you should have a right to. Nothing else makes sense. Now, you might say, well, what about a communal sort of structure where, I work and I grow potatoes, but I throw it into the pot. And other members of the community also throw what they have into the pot. And we all share alike. The problem with that, of course, is that how do you measure those things? I mean, how many of my potatoes are needed for me to be able to take someone's meat, someone that brought some meat to the table? Now, it can be done. but it can only be um, it can only be workable if we all want basically the same things. In other words, how do you trade shelter for food? The community is difficult to structure in that way. Any measure of fairness. Suppose I could have picked 30 potatoes that day, but only picked 5. You still have to look at people maximizing their efforts. Presumably, if you're working for yourself, then you're going to maximize your effort because you might want 30 potatoes. And so you're going to consume them. I think it's a recognition of human nature. Do I think if human beings were more evolved, that we'd be more communal? We would be less concerned about what each is bringing to the table and whether that was appropriate or not? Perhaps. Maybe somewhere down the road we'll evolve to a place, either because of technology or just some other social particulars, or maybe an array of social particulars or an interaction of those particulars. But at some point we might evolve to that, and that would be wonderful on some level, I guess. But in the in the hard, cold reality of the way human beings are right now, we have to say what you work for is yours. If you want to trade some of that for currency in a more modern society or barter, that's up to you. You grew the potatoes, do with them what you will. Just don't corrupt the process, because then the whole thing unravels. And so I think when people hear property, they think of the gluttony, which Locke was talking about. They think of people that have way more than they need. And I would argue that that's very appealing, to look at those in the society that have prospered way beyond what the normal person has managed, in part because we believe that no one can get that far down the road, become that wealthy, without having to store the system. Now, I think there are certainly examples of where that's occurred, and I think there are examples where it hasn't. Where people have been very prosperous but haven't monopolized, haven't manipulated, got out into the marketplace and just had a great idea, and got it out there and people wanted it. Whether or not we think that that idea was worth anything or fruitful, that's not the point. Do any of us think that a movie actor, for example, should be paid $20 million for a movie, or that an athlete should be paid, an incredible sum of money for playing a game? Well, we argue that it's not whether or not the activity is of value in terms of what it contributes in serious, important, benefits to society. But we've decided we like to be entertained. We like to watch sports. We like to watch movies. And we're willing to pay for that. And they have every right, these actors and athletes, to say, okay, well, my services are in demand. And so I should get paid, accordingly. And that makes perfect sense. We may not like the fact that they do it, but then stop going to the movies. Stop watching sporting events. And their salaries will go down. So you're meeting the demand of the public. And the public doesn't always act collectively or individually in a rational way. Why would you spend, $50 to go see someone hit a ball? Well, people will do it. And that's all that matters. Why? Life, liberty, and property. Couple that with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we have a right to be happy. It makes me feel good to watch somebody hit a ball. I like that. It eases my mind and makes me feel good. So if I want to invest some of my hard-earned money, which I have a property right to watch that, that's my decision to make. That's part of freedom. If a lot of people want to do that, it's a part of exercising freedom. We may not like the outcome. A lot of money going to areas or individuals that we don't really think is the best use of money, but we do it. I think in America, little pop psychology here, it may be possible that one of the reasons why we like to see people rise is because we want to believe that we all can do it. And one of the reasons why we like to see them fall, I think, is because on some fundamental level, we have this worth problem. That no one's really worth that kind of money. But we like what they do. They came out of nowhere, they're prospering, good for them. But now they've got too much. So perhaps that's at work in that dynamic. But for our purposes, that doesn't matter, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, because if it makes you feel good to have the world's largest assortment of pencils, then you should have a right to pursue that, right? It's when I'm taking any chance of anybody else getting those pencils that may be problematic. That might be gluttonous. When I can spend $100,000 a day on a yacht to go on vacation, so I spent almost $1 million to go on vacation for, say, 10 days. Is that gluttonous? I would argue that most of us think, yeah. But if that person has got that money by legitimate means, hasn't manipulated the marketplace, hasn't manipulated law, legitimately got it for producing or doing something that was of value to others, I think we have to accept that and say, yeah, there are people starving, and this person is riding around on a yacht that costs them $100,000 a day. I think we can argue about those things, but don't we all want to believe that that's possible for all of us? I don't know. It seems to me that gluttony is a difficult thing to define. Corruption is less so. It's more evident. You can kind of see it. All right, so what it comes down to now is, all right, so all of this in terms of different sources of law and what morality is and what ethics are, brings us down to a couple of fundamental concepts, right? One of which is what's fair. I mean, isn't that what we all sort of tie into anyway? What's really fair here? So let's define what we mean by fair, right? Fair, I think it's reasonable to say, right, is fundamentally based upon impartiality and honesty. What I mean by that is I may think it's fair that I have all the money in the world, but is it really? Well, I'm not impartial. Of course I'm going to think I should have all that. So when you take someone that's impartial and they make a decision, that seems to probably have or should have more value. And honesty, of course, is key to a society. And that's the purpose, obviously, of law. The idea, or it's at least creates a forum for that. So fair is marked by impartiality and honesty. Now, does it mean you must be totally free of self-interest? No. Does it mean that you can't carry your prejudices? No. Does it mean you don't have your favorites? No. But if we're going to say it's fair, it should be, the amount of self-interest should be minimized, if not eradicated. Same thing with prejudice or favoritism, right? So a very fair person here is going to be one that is impartial and honest, and that means free from self-interest, prejudice, and favoritism. Now, that's not possible, right? It's not possible. If you had a choice between, one of your friends or siblings or children getting a job that they were not as qualified for as someone you didn't know or had no investment in terms of emotional investment or the like, you'd be perfectly okay with them not getting the job. The other guy, with your sibling or friend getting the job. Now, that's favoritism, right? That's serving your own self-interest to be, sort of liked by your friends, your family. It's prejudicial. It's not fair. Because fair means that you're impartial and you're honest. And you can turn to your sibling, whatever, and say, well, I'd love to give you the job, but you're not as qualified as the other person. You don't know as much. You've not proven yourself as much. Why don't you go out into the marketplace and do that and then come back? You can only imagine the feelings and the upset that would be exchanged there. So when we talk about, impartial and honest, we're talking about, somewhat free from self-interest, prejudice, and favoritism, but also fair must conform with the rules of the society, right? The rules of the society, we hope, are impartial and based on honesty, right? And that basically our actions are consistent with that sense of fairness. The idea is about, self-interest and prejudice and favoritism is that we're human beings and we're likely to demonstrate that. So in a court of law, we try and minimize the likelihood of that. Justice is blind. You give me the person before me, you give me the facts, and the rules get applied, and that's fair. But we'll go more into fairness, later, because it means that we have to go ahead and we have to figure out some structure for determining what is fair and what is not fair. And that's not always an easy thing to do. We also have to come to terms with the idea of justice, right? Now, keep in mind that justice is really a function or the quality of being fair. Fair and reasonable. And that's a key word, reasonable, right? Because reasonable means that you've got a rationale behind the way in which you process conflicts and all the other societal, issues you have to deal with, right? That basically justice is about fairness. And you'll see that as we go down the line, right? And that's why justice is supposed to be blind. Because fair means what? Not pursuing your own self-interest, right, at the expense of another, right? And honesty and all that. So if we have that in place, we have justice. So, what's law? Definitionally, law is nothing more than a system of those rules. And those rules are unique to the country or the community or whoever it is that recognizes the way in which those laws are written, the authority to write them, and basically the members of the society have agreed, whether it's through their representatives or direct vote or what have you, have agreed to, to behave a certain way and to accept penalties if they don't. So this leads to a very, very important question. Okay, we have all these laws. We understand that the difference between them. We know that obviously justice, law, these things are very important to the functioning of a society. We know the pursuit of our liberty is key, right? Our lives, sustaining ourselves, and the right to hold property. And we can assume that in holding property, we're made happier. That, having something, that house, that car, that garden, that relationship, I have a right to it. It makes me happy. And the reason for that is very simple. It's what I call the blue ball approach to things, which is here we are on this little blue ball hurling through space at a very fast speed, revolving on an axis. We don't know where we came from and we don't know where we're going. And we're smart enough to know that that's our situation. So what would an intelligent being do under those circumstances? You would try and live, you would try and be free, and you would try, to obtain things for yourself, to make yourself feel good on that journey. It's perfectly natural, right, to want those things because that's all you really have. And it's perfectly natural to form societies, nations, that will protect that. So the question now becomes, okay, we've talked about morality, right? We've talked about ethics. We've talked about fair. We've talked about justice. We've talked about law. We've talked about the sources of law. We've made a comparison of those across the board. And now the question is, okay, let's go back right to the beginning. Is there a universal morality? Is there a way in which we can understand life, liberty, and property in a way that creates a fair society? Remember, fair is a very important thing here. And you're going to see later on that fair is what the court system and the structure is all about. So is there a way to look at this? And there are any number of ways in which people have thought about this. But I'm going to talk about John Rawls's theory of justice because I think it's a very good way to sort of get our minds around any universal morality that might exist, right? And fundamentally, if you look at the things people want, primarily, right, things like liberty, obviously opportunity, wealth or income, that all these things, we have to decide how they get distributed, right? Now, if there's an unequal distribution, then it's going to not favor, those that are weakest amongst us. And of course, we can get into the argument about what everybody deserves from everyone else. in terms of respect and every individual's rights. But there's going to be an unequal distribution of goods, services, and it's going to be not to the advantage of the least favored. You know, when you think about how much of one's life is not determined by their actions, I think in America, our structure is that anyone can be anything they want to be. And that's clearly not the case. If you look at how much luck or circumstance is involved in where you end up and therefore what you can do, it's pretty amazing how little control we have. So let's just talk about that for a second. Let's go off on a very slight tangent here to establish the point. You are born to parents that you don't choose. You don't know anything about their family background. You don't know what kinds of illnesses that family typically has. You don't know the genetic code that you're being you're inheriting or you're getting. You don't know anything about the biological connection in terms of what advantages and disadvantages you're going to have. And in fact, there's a whole slew of genes and the like that are in the mix, and depending upon the way they align themselves, you could have members of the same family getting very different qualities. One could be very athletic, for example, and the other very uncoordinated. So even within the same family, there's a genetic pool. And while family members, draw from that pool, they're not all getting the same genes, they're not getting the same stuff. No one makes a decision about what to get. You just get it. And that includes being born with birth defects, infirmities of one kind or another, mental difficulties, as extreme as you want to get, cancer. None of that is by choice. You just end up where you end up. So now you're born with all that, none of which you had any control over. Now you're born into an environment that you have no control over. If you're born in America, it's probably better than being born in a part of the world where it's war-torn and where a child's life is meaningless, right? So the environment you're born into, the place, you have no say over. None whatsoever. Just like you have no say over your parents. Most of us would probably have liked to have been born to a very, very wealthy, family, or one with a lot of power. But that's not how it works. The King of England doesn't choose to be the King of England. Just arrives, and that's the circumstance. So we're put into all kinds of circumstances with whatever genetic material we've been given. We have no say over our parents, our genetic material, and where we're born. Now, we also have no control over the time in which we're born. What I mean by that is we don't know what year we're going to be born. We don't choose that. So if you're born and you're born back in 300 years ago, and you have a good voice, you're probably not going to make it because at that point there was not amplification, right? So those that had good voices but couldn't project, didn't have strong voices, wouldn't be able to garner an audience so they can make a living at it, let alone some millions and millions and millions of dollars. So you're born at a time of electricity and amplification and you've got a good voice. You're infinitely better off than someone that was born 300 years ago with, a good voice but no amplification. So you have no control over that, the moment in time in which you're born. So you have no control of genetic makeup, no control over your parents, no control of where you're born, and no control over when you're born, into what age, right? What generation. I dare say that if you look at a lot of popular culture and you think in terms of would this have been made, would this have been successful 50, 100 years ago? Think about all the people that are actors, and they're actors in large measure because there's a need for more actors. Why? It's not 3 networks anymore, right? ABC, NBC, CBS. It's not, 2 or 3 major movie, companies making movies. there's a need to put stuff out because there's a market, because Americans want to be entertained.